Lecture 3, the practice of preventive diplomacy and early warning. We have our resource person, my brother. I'm happy he's able to join us, Dr. Chris Nwonu, the Director General, National Early Warning Center, Office of the Vice President. Please a round of applause for him. Chris.
Mitigate and contain threats to human security. And as we all know, human security is a very broad, much broader conception of security that goes beyond physical safety, goes beyond physical violence, and goes beyond national security. So human security is an all-encompassing concept that includes political security, it includes gender security, it includes climate security, food security, energy security. It addresses the full spectrum of issues and threats that plague the well-being of our citizens, of human beings. And this concept of security was pioneered in 1994 in the United Nations Development Program, Human Development Report. That was the first time that it was conceptualized and mainstreamed in international relations. At the time, the thinking was that whereas during the Cold War era, the primary threats to mankind lay in hostilities, conflicts between states, wars between states. But in the aftermath of the Cold War, particularly with the demise of the Soviet Union, the bipolar world order gave way to a new order in which the primary threats to human well-being emanated from conflicts within societies, conflicts within states, whether they are described as civil wars or insurgencies or insurrections. The axis of hostilities had moved from being between states to being within states. And as a result of interrogating the issues of conflict and crisis at that time, the understanding was that we needed a much broader conception of security that went beyond just national security, one that was much more all-embracing. And so the concept of human security was evolved at the time and mainstreamed. Now, subsequently, starting from 1994, when it was mainstreamed by the United Nations, human security has been adopted and embraced by a number of regional organizations, various institutions of global governance, as well as regional institutions, ECOWAS being one of them, the African Union being one of them. So the conception of human security is consistent, for example, with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is, again, the flagship Charter on Human Rights for this continent. ECOWAS followed suit in the late 1990s and the early 2000s because it was trying to make sense of the civil wars and insurgencies and insurrections that were breaking out across the sub-region. And it realized that it was not prudent or judicious to simply wait to react to these issues as they happen. Rather, the emphasis had to be on prevention, and had to be particularly on early warning and response. Early warning brings us into a domain where we are able to receive anticipatory intelligence about things. Usually in our particular context, what we'll be discussing is geopolitical risk, geoeconomic risk, all kinds of geostrategic factors that are shaping the world order today. And using that anticipatory intelligence to guide what we call preventive diplomacy. And I'm sure you all know what preventive diplomacy is. The point is that the entire purpose of early warning is to engage in preventive action. There's a saying that if a snake bites before it is charmed, then there is no profit to the charmer. So early warning is a bit like snake charming. But the point is that you must charm the serpent before it bites. The entire point of early warning is prevention, preventive action, preventive engagement, preventive mediation, and preventive diplomacy. But in taking these two concepts, early warning and preventive diplomacy, both of these concepts depend entirely on what we will call geostrategic awareness or geotemporal awareness. In other words, they depend upon an awareness of what is going on, the trends, the threats, the issues and the factors that are shaping the world as we know it, the world order as we know it. And so in that regard, one of the principles that I would like to disclose to you and discuss with you is the idea that history is the ultimate early warning system. History is the ultimate early warning system because as people in the fields of political science or even international relations have discovered, human beings have the habit of repeating history. And in fact, when you look at the design of our systems and bureaucracies of governance institutions, typically, governance institutions are designed to address the last crisis. That is what has already happened. Now, early warning is an invitation to us to move beyond that orientation to the past and begin to think much more concretely about probabilities, what may happen, what could happen. And in other words, what we trade in are forecasts, geopolitical forecasts, geoeconomic forecasts, forecasts around the dynamics of international relations as they unfold. We want to be able to anticipate and say, what will this region, let us say West Africa for example, what will West Africa look like in the next 10 years? What will the Sahel look like in the next 10 years? Nigeria has a very unique geostrategic location. It is located at an intersection of the equatorial, the Sahelian, and the Atlantic. And so it is vulnerable to trends from those three geographical and geopolitical domains. So when we look at our regional neighborhood, one of the things that we're interested in as early warning practitioners is the question of what will this region look like 10 years from now? What will become the Gulf of Guinea? What will become of the Gulf of Guinea? What will become of the Sahel? What will become of Central Africa, which again we have very close relations to? And of course, what will become of West Africa? I'm sure that 10 years ago, we were not anticipating the spate of unconstitutional changes of government that have happened in the Central Sahel. There are a number of things that we did not anticipate. So from the perspective of an early warning institution or even a practitioner of international relations who is interested in early warning, the question that confronts us is understanding what trends are emerging today that may not look very significant now, but in the next 5 to 10 years, they will be the defining trends of this region. If you had said 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago, that a day would come when the United States would completely dismantle its apparatus of official development assistance, it would have been very difficult to accept and to understand. But here we are in the present day, the new administration in the United States has dismantled its apparatus of official development assistance. Aid has reduced drastically. In fact, it has almost been completely eliminated. And that will continue. This looks like something that in the near term will continue to be an issue for us, particularly for aid-dependent countries in Africa. So the United States is an Agency for International Development, as I'm sure you are all aware, has essentially been mothballed for now. And in Nigeria, one of the things we did at the beginning of this year, or from late last year into the beginning of this year, was to analyze the potential risks that we would be confronting if the United States pulled out its aid contributions to our country. And it was very grim, to put it mildly. We know, among other things, we know now that 28,000 health workers, and this is just disclosed by the Minister of Health, that 28,000 health workers were being actually paid their wages by the United States Agency for International Development. So what this means is that we will experience vulnerabilities in healthcare. There will be specific health interventions that will suffer as a result of the withdrawal of that form of development assistance. There is a significant chunk of climate financing, funds meant to help finance climate mitigation and climate adaptation that are now at risk. We must regard those funds as no longer viable or available to us. If the United States continues along these lines, what does it mean for the assistance that it has rendered to us, particularly to our military? There are various military assistance programs that the United States funds. What does that mean in terms of our own efforts to secure our country? What does that mean for the capacity, building the capacity, our defense capacities, building our military capacities, especially because we are fighting 3 insurgencies. It's not just what is happening in the northeast, but we have a situation in the northwest, we have a situation in the southeast, and even in the Niger Delta, what you have is a frozen conflict. So, an early warning practitioner, and indeed the idea, the concept of early warning, is to prepare us, not just for eventualities, but for probabilities, for possibilities. In order to govern effectively, any strategic institution must be focused not just on the present, not just on what is manifesting in the present, but what could potentially manifest. And so that is what I want to discuss today. I think that as a first concept, we've already said that history is the ultimate early warning system. And those of us that are in the discipline of the humanities, whether it's in political science or sociology or international relations, we have a particular advantage because we have a unique faculty, a unique facility with historical understanding. History tends to repeat itself because civilizations are made up of human beings, and human beings are repetitors of habits. You know, we are creatures of habit. And when you look at how civilizations or even great powers particularly rise and fall, you will find common patterns, common symptoms, common signs and pathologies that accompany the rise or the fall of great powers. When you look at nations, cultures, civilizations, you will find that they behave in very similar ways, even though yes, there is great diversity on the planet and all of that, but there are fundamentals of human psychology as relating to national identity, national power, as relating to great power competition that are remarkably consistent throughout history. Nations tend to behave largely in the same way. And so when people say, for example, and I'm sure you hear this phrase, when people say things like, it's only in Nigeria that, I always cut them short and say nothing happens only in Nigeria. Nigeria is not exceptional in that sense. A lot of things that we're encountering as a country now have been encountered by other countries, are actively being encountered currently by other countries. We are not the only country that is fighting more than one insurgency. India is fighting more than one insurgency. Colombia has just come out of a multi-decade insurgency. We are not the only country that will spend over a decade fighting insurgency. As a general rule, fighting insurgencies takes time. So since the end of the Second World War, the average insurgency has taken no less than 3 decades to deal with. We are not the only country that will eventually realize that you cannot defeat insurgencies by purely military or kinetic means. You will find that as a general rule, most insurgencies are not resolved militarily. In contemporary history, there's only been one that was resolved militarily, and that was the insurgency of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka is a unique geography because it's an island, and it was easy to use a scorched earth approach. But when your country borders several countries, is located in the Sahel, there's a vast unpoliced border between us and our Sahelian neighbors. It is absolutely impossible to deal with an insurgency with purely military means. The second reason is that insurgencies, by their very orientation, are actually armed social movements. They are highly militarized social movements. In the field of warfare, we started talking about wars among the people, and I'm sure that this is something our military colleagues are familiar with as a concept. The idea that the wars of the 21st century are being fought predominantly by extralegal paramilitary formations that embed themselves in civilian communities. They hide within the population. They do not wear uniforms. They do not use an order of battle that will be recognizable to conventional warriors or specialists in conventional warfare. So what that tells us is that simply relying on military means to defeat insurgencies is unrealistic. And I must stress that this is not a realization that is unique to us as Nigerians. Everywhere across the world where insurgencies have lasted for a long time, this realization has been reached by the governments, and at the end they had to reach some other form of resolution that involved using non-kinetic assets to complement investments in the military. So I say all that to say that nations generally behave in the same way, because we are dealing with profoundly fundamental factors of human psychology that have to do with national power, national security, international relations, etc., etc. Now, when we talk about the current situation, where we are in and where we are at, there are maybe 2 or 3 questions we want to ask ourselves. The first is, where are we in history? That is one. Secondly, what is the nature of the present international order? What are the governing dynamics of the present international? Interrogates what the true strategic intent is behind official development assistance. Is it something that is designed to create a form of dependency that leaves us vulnerable, for example? Because I imagine that if you are in a country and they tell you that a significant proportion of your workforce in a critical sector like healthcare are actually paid for by a foreign country, that has created a very significant dependency and a very significant vulnerability. And we have seen across Africa where situations in which countries have tried, foreign countries, great powers, have tried to blackmail or intimidate recipient countries into adopting policies that they do not want to adopt, and using the threat of withholding aid or withholding development assistance. There are countries in Africa that up to 40% of their budgets are funded by foreign development assistance. So under those circumstances, a country cannot have autonomy. It cannot have strategic autonomy if significant and critical sectors of its national life are funded by development assistance. I hope you understand the point I am making. I say all this to say that the world order in which we have entered is one that will be defined by realism, not idealism. And in the realist school of geopolitics, we accept that nations operate as rational actors, computing their strategic national interest. That is the primary motive for everything that they do. And this is a reality that we in Nigeria and Africa have to wake up to. The third point that will define this era is that we are going to increasingly see examples of what I call nuclear nationalism, but which can also be understood as nuclear proliferation. And by that, what I mean is that when regional or global governance institutions unravel, the common security guarantees that they created also unravels. So what this means is that countries now realize that they have to take steps to invest significantly in their own national defenses. So for example, if we take again the Ukraine conflict, the conflict in Ukraine happening in Europe, one of the things we are seeing, and which Donald Trump has repeated since his first term, is that European countries must pay significantly more than they are paying to NATO as part of their dues to NATO. The US is the single largest contributor. Indeed, the US is the actual guarantee of common defense for NATO. NATO is an alliance of Western countries, but let there be no mistake, NATO is the United States. It's the way that if we talk about ECOWAS and we say we want to mobilize West African troops, with the greatest of respect to all other member states, nobody is seriously expecting other countries to provide troops. They expect Nigeria to provide the military muscle. This is historically how it has been. So when we say ECOWAS and we talk about common interventions in ECOWAS or in the West African sub-region, what we are actually talking about is Nigeria. And it's the same thing that goes for NATO. When we talk about intervention by NATO or the military muscle of NATO, what we are talking about is American military might. But now we're in a situation in which the United States has signaled that it will not be vested in NATO unless the other countries contribute up to 5% of their own GDP to defense requirements of NATO. Now, again, there's nothing altruistic or sentimental about this. Cursory research will show that most of NATO's armaments are actually produced by US defense manufacturers. So when the US government says we want Western countries in NATO to pay more for the defensive umbrella that we are providing, what they are saying is that we want you to buy more American-made weapons of war. I hope you can see this, that this is the pursuit of national interest. There is absolutely nothing sentimental about it. Lastly, in terms of the unraveling of institutions, we've talked about the threat to NATO, we've talked about the European Union. We must not forget that ECOWAS itself is facing that threat and indeed has experienced that threat. I think a few weeks ago, the exit of the Central Sahelian countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger Republic became formal, right? And as of now, what you have are two regional blocs. One is the Alliance of Sahelian States, the other is ECOWAS. But this is consistent with the patterns that we've already highlighted previously, that as the world order fractures and fragments, we are going to see this breakdown in regional security mechanisms, regional governance mechanisms, and this is one of the trends that we need to prepare ourselves for. Lastly, this new order signals the end of the post-1945 order. As I said previously, the United Nations Security Council and the current institutions of global governance were shaped after the end of the Second World War. And when we look at the permanent membership of the United Nations, those that have veto powers, you are looking essentially at the countries that emerged victorious after the Second World War. But the power dynamics of today has thrown up a new range of significant players, significant actors that are not part of that Security Council membership. They are not at the highest levels of the pecking order. And so what we will find is that we are entering a period in which the realities of the dynamics of power in the geopolitical space will now be renegotiated, because now we have a new range of powers that will not simply accept that they are subordinate to the countries that are in the UN Security Council. I mean, if you take the United Kingdom, for example, the United Kingdom ceased to be an empire over 50 or 60 years ago. It is really, its significance in international relations lies more in its relationship with the United States than with any inherent military or economic superiority that it might possess. It doesn't possess those things anymore. The entire significance of the United Kingdom lies almost entirely in its relationship with the United States and its dependence on the defensive umbrella that is provided by the United States. Now, when we talk about the other factors that will define the era in which we've entered, one of the trends that I think will be significant is what I describe as the end of sovereignty. And Article 1 of the United Nations Charter makes the sovereignty of nation states inviolate. It is sacrosanct. That is the very first principle upon which the United Nations have been founded. But what we've seen in recent times, going back the last 10, 20 years even, is that the nation states, the sovereignty of nation states is no longer regarded as inviolate. As we speak, we know that Russian troops obviously are in Ukraine, so there's a conflict situation happening there. But Russia's justification for its invasion of Ukraine was the protection of its own national security. That was its justification. That continues to be the official position of the Russian government, that it invaded Ukraine, among other things, to preempt the potential membership of Ukraine in NATO, which would bring Western powers and Western adversaries of Russia right to its borders, which from a geostrategic perspective was unacceptable to the Russians. So the defense or the justification of protecting national security increasingly is being used to violate the sovereignty of nations. So what this means is that the sovereignty of nations is no longer an article of faith as far as international relations is concerned. I say that also because just as Russia justifies its invasion of Ukraine on the basis of national security, Israel justifies its invasion of Syria and Lebanon on the same basis. Its violation of the integrity, I think as of just yesterday, Israel launched a military strike on targets inside of Syria. But in any case, Israeli troops have been inside Syria since late last year. Israeli troops frequently have violated the territorial integrity of Lebanon, citing national security concerns. Here in Africa, Rwandan troops and Rwandan-backed militias, particularly the M23 forces in eastern Congo, have been there, and Rwanda's justification is that it is preserving its own national security. And it makes no difference to anyone in terms of attempting to sanction one country. So for example, there are countries that have threatened to sanction Rwanda. But it is difficult to sanction Rwanda separately when Israel is doing the same thing. And if we accept that countries can invade other countries on the pretext of preserving their national security, then why should it be unacceptable when Rwanda does it, but acceptable when Israel does it? I hope you understand the point being made. That if we're in an era in which common security guarantees, the institutions of global governance have collapsed or are unraveling, then increasingly what we will see is a rule of the strong. We will see the principle that might makes right will become the dominant factor in international relations. This will be very destabilizing for global peace, because what it means is that countries that consider themselves to be much more powerful than other countries will simply invade those countries and have their way. It may be a situation where they invade a country to even appropriate its mineral resources or to resolve boundary disputes or whatever the case might be. But the world that we have entered and the defining features of this world order suggest to us that we are in a period in history in which the strong nations, militarily strong nations, will do what they must. And there is a saying that the powerful do what they must or what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. So a weak country in this era is one that may not have the military capabilities to defend itself, to defend its own interests, or may not have the strategic alliances it requires to defend itself against the predations of more powerful countries. If you look at, and I want to give perhaps a signature example of this particular trend, again I will cite the Ukraine conflict. You will find that the United States is negotiating a peace with Ukraine that does not involve Ukraine. It is negotiating that peace agreement with Russia. And in the realist school of geopolitics, what we will say is that we are not pretending that proxy actors have any power in this conflict. It is the two main powers, because what is going on in Ukraine has been characterized as a proxy conflict between the US and the West on one side and Russia on the other. And you're familiar with the saying that when two elephants fight, the grass suffers. So the grass does not mediate between two elephants. The two elephants resolve the issues themselves. And that is what we are seeing. We are seeing a situation in which two great powers are negotiating a peace that involves a third country about a conflict happening in a third country to the exclusion of that third country. They are not part of the conversation, right? And that is a sign of the world order into which we have entered. That this is a world order in which strong nations, particularly strong nations that have significant amounts of hard power, will simply define the reality, and the rest of the world will follow. And this is not the first time that this has happened. Part of the negotiations for Ukraine or peace in Ukraine involve Ukraine now surrendering the territory, the portions of its territory that Russia has taken control of. But this month is the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference. And what happened at the Berlin Conference? Powerful European nations came and divided Africa. Had a conference, I imagine it must have been much like this, and divided the African continent among themselves. And not a single African nation was represented. There was no African involved in that conversation. And Africa could not be involved in that conversation because it was weak. And that is the long and short of it. It was weak. If we were strong, we would have been at the table. But because we were weak, we were not at the table. And so the signs that we see in the current age suggest that we might be moving in that direction, where powerful nations begin to redefine borders, international borders, or begin to redefine the new rules of engagement to the exclusion of the weaker countries. So this age will be defined, as I said, by the rule of the strong. And we have these powerful nations, the United States, China, Russia, the BRICS as an emerging formation, right? As an emerging formation. We are going to, as I said, enter the age of plural hegemonies, where rather than having one or two major powers, what you will have will be regional hegemons in many different places. For us as Nigeria, and as Nigerians who think about this national order, in what ways have we transitioned, or has the international order changed, or in what ways do we discern that it is changing? These are the questions that we want to answer when we talk about geotemporal awareness. It's a combination of two words, obviously geographical and temporal, which is to say we are interested in what is happening in the present time as it relates to what has happened in the past. But obviously we're also interested in the geopolitical dynamics, the geoeconomic dynamics. So as an early warning actor, or as someone interested in early warning, this very much is about situational awareness, and it's about understanding the ways in which the world order is changing. The world order is not static, and we are now in an age of very, very profound change as far as the world order is concerned. Between 1945 and 1990, we lived in the age of the Cold War. The world order was defined by a bipolar rivalry between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s ended that chapter of history, and we moved from the bipolar order to the unipolar order. The unipolar order was an era defined by the singular, overwhelming dominance and superiority of the United States as the world's sole superpower. That era has now come to an end. From all indications, from everything that we can see, that era has now come to an end. We are now entering what many people are describing as a multipolar era. Not a bipolar era, but a multipolar era. It's an era that will be defined not by one or two major superpowers, but will be defined largely by regional hegemons. The most significant manifestation of this trend is the emergence of the BRICS formation. BRICS, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These are countries that typically would have been regarded as medium powers 20 years ago, 25 years ago, or 30 years ago. But today, China economically dwarfs the United States. China is economically the most powerful country on the planet. There's evidence that suggests that it is probably the most societally advanced at this point in history. Beyond that, you look at India. India is a nuclear power, so is Russia. And even though Russia is diminished from what it was in the 1990s when it was the Soviet Union, it is still a very capable, militarily and very, very significant world power. And now this formation that we call the BRICS now represents the emergence of rival powers. Powers that are considered rival to the dominance of the West, the long-term dominance of the West, and particularly the dominance of the United States. So the world order in which we are entering is one that will not be defined by one superpower or two. It will be defined by the concept of emerging powers. Often there will be regional hegemons that specifically dominate different parts of the planet. So for example, for Russia, we expect that Russia will become the dominant actor in Eurasia. We expect that China will continue to dominate in Southeast Asia and in Asia generally. We expect that South Africa, for example, will remain the hegemon in Southern Africa. So this is a world order that will be dominated significantly by regional hegemons, not by one superpower, not even by two, but by regional hegemons. Now, that world will be defined by a number of other subsidiary shifts. Remember that the fundamental shift that has happened is that we are moving from the unipolar order and we are entering a multipolar order. And one of the things that history tells us, and remember I started by saying that history is the ultimate early warning system. Historically, whenever there has been a transition from one world order to the other, it has been characterized by conflict. The governing institutions of a given world order unravel, and then you have a period of conflict, and then we transit into another system or into another world order. So if you take the League of Nations, for example, the League of Nations was established in 1920 and it was disbanded in 1946. Between its formation and its dissolution, the Second World War happened. That was the defining conflict of the era. Upon the completion of the Second World War, the United Nations was established in 1945. When you look at the transition from the post-1945 order to the unipolar order, you will find patterns of conflict as well. It was those conflicts that eventually led to the mainstreaming of ideas of human security. Conflicts accompanies transitions in the world order, because what that means is that usually one great power is being retired and another great power is emerging. So after the Second World War, the British Empire, which at that point controlled about a quarter of the planet, relinquished its power and was supplanted by the United States. The United States became the leading Western superpower of its era, but it also had to accommodate the rise of some other significant powers, notably Russia in the form of the Soviet Union, China, France, and the UK. Now, those 5 countries constitute what we call the Security Council. They are the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So today, when we look at the United Nations Security Council, what you're seeing is a relic of the post-1945 order. It does not reflect the power dynamics of today's world. What it does is that it reflects the power dynamics of the world order that emerged after the end of World War II. One of the other indicators that accompanies shifts and transitions between world order is that global governance institutions and regional institutions begin to unravel. And just as the League of Nations collapsed in 1946, what we are seeing are signs that the global governance institutions that have dominated the planet for the last 70 years are now unraveling. So you take, for example, United Nations, when the United States, which is the headquarters of the United Nations, ironically enough, is threatening to pull out of the United Nations and has pulled out of subsidiary United Nations entities like the World Health Organization. It has pulled out of certain United Nations compacts, like the Compacts on Climate Change. There is a very significant likelihood that the United States could either formally pull out of the United Nations or reduce its involvement in the United Nations to a point where a formal pullout becomes unnecessary and becomes redundant. That is, it will become so uninvolved in the United Nations that it might as well not be a member of the United Nations. But beyond that, when we look at the European Union, for example, if you look at the European Union, you look at the fractures that came to a head in 2013, I think it was 2013 or 2014, when the United Kingdom pulled out, Brexit, as it was famously called. And today we are now seeing countries, member countries of the European Union, suggesting that they want to follow their own individual national immigration policies. As you all know, the European Union is a common immigration area. But if Germany, for example, or France, or Italy, says that they want to pursue their own individual national immigration policies, then in practice what it means is that the European Union will cease to exist. Because at the heart of the European Union Charter is the idea of movement, free movement across borders. That is why we have the Schengen visa, for example. But if individual countries say that they want to take on national strategies for confronting the challenges of irregular migration, or even regular migration as they conceive of it, then what that means is that the European Union will functionally cease to exist as a free move, as an area of free movement and potentially of free trade. But what about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? NATO has existed since 1949. It existed, when it was created in 1949, it was created to defend Western Europe from the East Bloc and the Warsaw Pact alliance that was led by Soviet Union. But today we find a situation where the United States has again reduced or retrenched its investments, let us say, and its commitment to NATO. In fact, we have the new administration under the new president, Donald Trump, has expressed an unwillingness or a lack of commitment to Article 5. I think it's Article 5. Article 5 is the clause in the NATO Charter that stipulates common defense. That means when one member country is attacked, then other countries are bound by that charter to intervene in favor of that country. But there's every indication that the United States is not interested in following through on that commitment. And this is easy to understand from a geopolitical point of view. If you take Europe, for example, and we've seen what is ongoing now in the case of the Ukraine. America, the United States, has some unique geographical assets. One is that it is separated from the rest of the world and from all other rival powers by two large, very large oceans. One is the Atlantic, the other is the Pacific. Historically, that provided the US with enough geographical isolation to feel protected from rival powers that would otherwise have posed a threat. And in the way that the United States engages with the world, engages with partners, even its allies such as Europe, you will find that that sense that it is isolated and therefore protected from other rival powers is very dominant. So last year, I had the privilege of being at a conference in Germany, and I was engaging with German officials, NATO officials, and one of the things that I proposed to them was that the conflict in Ukraine is fundamentally different for Europe from how the United States sees it. For Europe, Ukraine is a European country, and this war is the bloodiest war that has happened on that continent since the end of World War II. But for the United States, because they are separated by a vast ocean, they saw hostilities in the Ukraine as an opportunity to strategically bleed and cripple Russia. And so they did not mind fanning the flames of that conflict because they believed that it would provide a strategic diversion for Russia that would consume its resources both economically and militarily. But for the Europeans, they are confronted by war, the horror of war, and the fact that the refugees in Ukraine, the outflux or outflow of refugee populations, displaced people from Ukraine, directly impacts European countries. It does not directly impact the United States. So I say all this to say that nations are rational actors, and when they act rationally, they act by computing what is in their own strategic interest. There's no sentiment about it. There's very little that supports the idea that nations, particularly in the field of international relations, act from a humanitarian basis predominantly. No, they do not. In fact, even humanitarian aid itself, when you look at the history of humanitarian aid, the evolution of humanitarian aid, what we call official development assistance or other forms, you will find that it has always primarily been construed as a strategic asset, as a strategic tool. We use aid. Powerful countries, richer countries, the great powers have always used aid to promote their own national interest. In other words, the promotion of strategic national interest has been the primary guiding principle of aid, not the moral impulse to help nations that are far away from you. And it's very important for us as Africans and as Nigerians to understand this, because I find that Africans, Nigerians, we run the risk of expecting too much from people that really have no business with us, that really have faced no shared threats that we are facing. And there's absolutely no reason for a country to invest resources in another country that is thousands of miles away from it. Absolutely none. And there is absolutely no reason for any country that is reasonable governed and considers itself a rational actor to expect that countries that are far away from it will keep committing millions of their own resources, millions of dollars of their own resources to help that country for no apparent reason other than goodwill or kindness or humanitarian impulse. It's an illusion. And so it is important for us to recognize that in an age in which nations operate as rational actors, the age of infinite humanitarian investment in the troubles of other countries is now over, and that is what we are seeing. If anything, Donald Trump is a wake-up call, because you cannot really be angry with somebody about what he does with his own money. I hope you understand what I'm saying. That ultimately, no African country, no country at all is entitled to development assistance. No country is entitled to aid, and no country is entitled to be helped by another country. And if we have been in a situation where we find that these countries that are separated from us by vast oceans, very far away from us, are committing significant resources to help us, to support us, allegedly, then we must, there are some questions that we must ask ourselves. Historically, Nigeria has been regarded as the regional hegemon in West Africa, right? ECOWAS itself was significantly a product of our own foreign policy in the 1970s. It was our way of manifesting our hegemony. Not in an aggressive fashion. This is why at the time General Woguw and Iyadema came together to create the building blocks for what became ECOWAS. But historically as well, within the West African sub-region, Nigeria has had a rival and a strategic adversary. That adversary has not been any of the countries in West Africa. Nigeria is significantly larger, its economy is dominant, its position in West Africa is unrivaled, militarily, economically, etc. But the rival that we have faced historically in the West African sub-region has been France. Historically, France has been the adversary, our geostrategic rival, our geostrategic adversary in the West African sub-region. Now, what we've seen historically, again, is that France, using its West African proxies, supported the rebels or the secessionist faction during the Nigerian Civil War. I hope you are all aware of this. And like all rival hegemons, what it sought was to break up a competitor. Size matters in geopolitics. Size is very important. And one of the most significant reasons why Africa has not really created or produced a globally significant hegemon is that the largest countries in Africa have faced significant challenges of internal coherence. In other words, if you do not have internal cohesion, it's very difficult to exercise power on the global stage. So when you look at Ethiopia, for example, a long history of civil war that ended with the split between Ethiopia and Eritrea. When you look at Sudan, for example, large landmass, but a long civil war that ended with the split of Sudan and South Sudan. You look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most naturally rich, resource-rich places on this planet. It's had a multi-generational civil war that has raged since the 1960s. In fact, one of my favorite anecdotes about the DRC is that as a young lieutenant in 1962, a man called Olusegun Obasanjo was abducted by rebels in DRC while on a peacekeeping mission. And they put him in the boot of their vehicle, they drove him around and debated whether to kill him or to set him free. And at some point they decided to set him free, and so they tossed him out. Obasanjo becomes president of Nigeria in 1999, serves 2 terms, and upon stepping down from the presidency in 2008, he's made a special envoy, I believe, of the AU to DRC to go and negotiate in the same conflict that he was part of a peacekeeping force in 40 or 50 years ago. The DRC is the poster child for multi-generational conflict, but I cite it to say that when you look at Africa, you find that the countries that have the size and the mineral resource potential to function as hegemons, regionally or even continentally, have been significantly beset by issues and crises of internal cohesion. And for us in Nigeria, certainly we have had our own challenges in that regard. But now that we are in an age in which in the last 3 or 4 years, what we've seen is that France is being supplanted by Russia in West Africa and in the Sahel. It raises the question of who can fill the geopolitical void, the strategic void in West Africa, now that France has been removed. France has been expelled from its previous strongholds and proxies in West Africa. Now, ordinarily, this should create an opportunity for us to come into our own and to step in, not forcefully, but assertively, as the regional hegemon, guaranteeing the security of the sub-region. Because we have the resources, because we have the size, and when you have the kind of resources that we do, there are certain roles that history confers on you. Benin Republic cannot play that role. Togo cannot play that role. Gambia cannot play that role. We are the biggest country in West Africa by population size for a reason. We are the largest economy in the sub-region for a reason. And if our primary rival for hegemony in the region has been removed, so to say, from the region, what does that mean for us now as a country? What does it mean in terms of our own foreign policy aspirations? What does it mean in terms of our own commitment to the cause of continental integration and regional integration, which has always been a foreign policy objective of Nigeria? And this issue is important because what we've seen is with the exit of France, we've seen the entry of Russia. And again, we need to ask ourselves, what does the growing prominence of Russia within West Africa and the Sahel mean for us? What strategically does it hold in terms of risks, in terms of opportunities, in terms of threats? We need to ask ourselves those questions because we are affected by these things. And I'll give one example. One of the most transformative transnational projects that we have embarked on in the last decade was the oil pipeline, the pipeline that was meant to go through Niger Republic all the way to the Mediterranean. It would have provided us or made us an alternate supplier to Russian energy for the European markets. But now, following the deterioration of relations with Niger Republic, since the military government came into place, that project has stalled. And the stalling of that project is absolutely to the advantage of Russia because it enables Russia to maintain the kind of stranglehold on energy supplies to Europe. I hope you understand this, right? So we must understand that we are not exempt from geopolitical dynamics, from grand geopolitical dynamics that are happening around us, whether at a global level, at a continental level, or at a regional level. And I say this insistently because I think that part of the challenge of being a large country that is very diverse, we have over 200 million people, 300 ethnic communities, multiple languages and dialects, we run the risk of being very insular and very preoccupied with our own internal political drama, which, while they may be entertaining on a day-to-day basis, from a strategic point of view are absolutely irrelevant. In fact, they are distractions. So while we are fighting over which governor's godfather is not allowing the godfather to, who is not allowing his godson to function, there are grand strategic trends around us that are shaping our destiny as a country. And we are preoccupied with the drama of low politics. Nigerians, I find, are very insular. If you look at our media, there's a civil war happening in Cameroon, for example, an insurgency happening in Cameroon. Insurgents in Cameroon link up with insurgents in southeast Nigeria, clearly established. But if you look at our media, you will not believe that anything is happening in Cameroon. You won't know. But if you lived in Europe, if we lived in Europe, it would not be possible to be in France or England or any European country and ignore the conflict happening in Ukraine. Why? Because it is happening in your own continent. So I find that one of our great weaknesses as a people is that we are very insular. We are preoccupied with our internal drama, which often is not very inspiring, which really does not lift us or elevate our thinking strategically in any way, while these grand strategic things are happening around us. And I will submit to you that part of the reason it is because of this insularity, this fixation on ourselves that is almost narcissistic, that we continually miss trends happening even in our regional neighborhood. So for example, how did we miss the turning of the tide in the Central Sahel and West Africa that throughout democratically elected governments have brought in military regimes? We completely missed it. How is that possible? If we are a regional hegemon, part of being a regional hegemon is having a finger on the pulse of developments happening. Nigeria is an Anglophone country surrounded by Francophone countries, right? But we seem almost completely blind to the level of anti-French sentiment in Francophone countries that were changing the political dynamics to the point now that you have at least one hostile government on our border, Niger Republic. So these are the ways in which the developments in geopolitics, the developments in international relations, and particularly the changes in the world order challenge us to elevate our thinking to a much more strategic level. The BRICS formation, Nigeria has been admitted not as a full member but as a partner country. We know that one of the aims expressed by the new administration in the United States is to ultimately disintegrate and subvert the BRICS formation because it is viewed as a threat. For among other reasons, potentially the threat that the BRICS countries could create another currency, a parallel currency that would overturn the dominance of the US dollar as the global currency. Now, what does that mean for us as a country that has very strong relations, both with the United States, but also with China? What does this mean for us in this age in which we have entered? How do we negotiate our own strategic autonomy, so to say, now that we know that this is the playing field, and this is a playing field of uncompromising powers who are acting ruthlessly in pursuit of their strategic interests? These are the kind of questions that need to have to exercise our minds. What happens if we face a situation where a powerful country sanctions us because of our trade relations with China, for example? Are we doing any thinking around this? Remember that early warning is about thinking of probabilities so that we can prevent them, not waiting for them to happen so that we can react. So the world is changing in a way that is compelling us to think very broadly and very deeply about the nature of our place in the world as a country. Lastly, or I think this should be the second to the last point, and this is quite important. What we're seeing, one of the other trends that we're seeing is that we find that the new administration in the United States, for example, has expressed an unwillingness to deploy troops, its own troops, American troops, to different places. There are many reasons for that, but the most important reason is that the deployment of troops to foreign countries on any military mission is very, very politically costly for an American president or an American administration. Americans don't like the idea that their children are being sent on military missions, often to countries that they have never heard about, and they die in missions of undefined objectives. So we are going to see, apparently, a drawdown in US military commitments to different places. One of the things that is very possible, which I've seen, I've come across it, quite possible that the US Africa Command, for example, might be wound down as part of load shedding and retrenchment from places that are not considered to be of high value strategic importance to the United States. What that means is that if one form of security guarantee is being retrenched, international relations does not permit a void. It must be filled by something else. And I believe that what we are going to have to grapple with will be the question of private military corporations coming into Africa, often at the behest of either the great powers or of their client regimes in Africa. A perverse incentive is created when mercenaries are brought into a conflict situation. It is to the profit of the mercenaries for the conflict to continue. So we might find that we've entered an era in which it is more profitable to fight wars than to win them. So you could have a conflict economy that continues to destabilize the region on a large scale, but continues to profit private military corporations from outside of the continent. Now, again, what should be our position? How do we prepare ourselves for the risks, the threats, and potentially, let's say, the opportunities that will arise as a result of this particular dynamic? Let me give an example of what I'm saying. Currently, we have the Wagner Group in the Central Sahelian countries I've mentioned. The Wagner Group was brought in because those governments believed that French and Western military forces had failed to confront or to end the insurgencies that were confronting them. Our assessment is that the Russians will be no more successful than the French or the UN were in dealing with the threats of the insurgencies, the uprisings, the rebellions, and the insurgencies in those countries. Because those insurgencies, and remember what I said in the beginning, is that an insurgency is essentially an armed, highly militarized social movement. Those insurgencies emanate from fundamental crisis of state legitimacy, the absence of a social contract. They are not challenges to democracy, they are challenges to the legitimacy of those states themselves. That kind of challenge cannot be resolved militarily. In time, the Russians will realize that. I believe that they already realize that, and will scale back their operations. The military governments of those countries will also realize that the Russians cannot solve this problem, that they themselves cannot solve the insurgency problem. But they will accept a trade-off in which the Russian mercenaries or private military corporations will provide regime security. That is, they will provide security for the regime and leave the rest of the country to its own devices. I hope you understand what I'm saying. And I believe that they will provide this particular service at the cost of control of mineral resources in those countries. But what it means ultimately is that the pattern of instability and fragility that we see in West Africa and the Sahel will likely continue for the next decade. And because Nigeria is a Sahelian country, partly a Sahelian country itself, it has implications for our own security. So, for example, we have a vastly unpoliced border with our neighbors to the north. We have an insurgency in the northeast. We have an insurgency in the northwest. Both of these insurgencies have significant transnational elements in them. How do we confront this reality that for the near future, some of our neighbors or part of our regional neighborhood will continue to face destabilization, or they will continue to face instability and fragility? This is something that should exercise our minds. And remember that historically, whenever there's been insecurity and fragility on a large scale in our neighboring states, they have had implications for us, security implications for us as a country. If you cast your mind back to the early 1980s, there was a terrorist group called the Metatsine group. Metatsine was an extremist organization. But what is more important, and why I'm citing this, is that when the federal government's inquiry into the Metatsine uprising was released, the Metatsine uprising started in 1980 and continued sporadically until 1985. It had a footprint in Kano, in Bauchi, in Borno, from the northwest to the northeast. When the federal government's inquiry report was released, one of the most significant things, factors adduced for the rise of Metatsine was that the collapse of the agrarian economies of our northern neighbors had created an influx of people into metropolises of northern Nigeria. And these were the places where Metatini was able to harvest his followers. It's not that Metatini was an entirely foreign phenomenon. No, there were Nigerians, but there were also Malians, there were Nigerians, there were Chadians, there were all of these people. The second instance that I will share or I will like to present to you is that from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, as a result of civil wars and instability in Chad and Niger, Nigerian border communities in the northeast particularly, but also the northwest, started to experience cross-border banditry on a large scale. In fact, on one occasion, the military government of Yobe State hired Nigerian mercenaries to provide protection for communities against Chadian bandits coming in. But I cite that to say that one of the reasons for the formation of the multinational joint task force was actually because of cross-border banditry, the bleed over of insecurity in Chad and Niger into the northeast and northwest of Nigeria. It started as an operation called Operation Flush, for those of you that remember this, in the 1990s, I believe. And that was eventually what was expanded into the multinational joint task force. So I raised this issue to simply say that we cannot be indifferent to the things happening above our northern frontier, or indeed in our regional neighborhood generally. If Niger becomes destabilized, if Niger collapses, it will have very adverse implications for our own national security. If any part of West Africa breaks down, it will hold very adverse implications for our human security generally. The last time we dealt with a major tropical infectious disease was the Ebola plague. And who can remember where the Ebola plague came from? It came from outside. It came from Liberia, right? So I cite all this to say that we cannot afford to be indifferent to the things happening in our regional neighborhood. Lastly, in terms of the trends that are defining our regional neighborhood, I wanted to make mention of one last one because I find this is significant, given our location geographically in this region. As I said earlier, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen unconstitutional changes of government that have removed elected governments and replaced them with military regimes. One of the ways in which we have thought about these issues, and one of the arguments that is put forward for intervening in those countries or trying to reverse the tide of military governments, is that if we do not do something now to either sanction those regimes or to ensure that those regimes are removed from power, that military dictatorships will spread across West Africa. There will be more coups and more unconstitutional changes of government. I would like to propose a slightly different argument, that the changes in these countries, particularly in the countries of the Central Sahel, do not pose a threat directly to us or to other democracies in West Africa, simply in terms of if a coup happens in Burkina Faso, then there's a high likelihood that a coup will happen in Ghana. No, I do not believe that to be the case. I think that what we will find is that there are countries that have very strong democratic traditions, and there are countries that have very weak democratic traditions. When you look at the countries of the Central Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, these are not countries that have strong democratic traditions. In fact, for most of their history, they've been governed by military regimes. So it's actually a misnomer to describe what has happened in those countries as a retreat from democracy. It's not a retreat from democracy. These are not countries with democratic traditions. If anything, the brief periods of democratic governance that they enjoyed were a retreat from their tradition of military governance. We have to see it as the other way, being the other way around. But what is important is that a coup in Burkina or in Mali does not presage a coup in Nigeria or in Ghana. We have significantly stronger institutions. The subordination of the military to civilian command authority is well advanced in our countries. But more importantly, when a coup happens in a country, the greater risk is actually to that country itself. And when you look at our own history of military rule, you will find that when we had a coup, having a coup simply made it more likely that there will be a counter coup and a counter coup, and then a cycle of coups will continue. So when we look at these countries in the Central Sahel, these military regimes, the risk that they pose directly is actually not to us, it's to themselves. The likelihood is that what you will have is a cycle of coups and counter coups that will continue probably for at least a decade, because sometimes it takes a while to exhaust this particular tendency in a country, right? And if you take Burkina, for example, remember that in Burkina Faso, the current head of state is actually the second head of state in a space of less than 2 years. We've forgotten that there was a head of state that actually overthrew the civilian government. That head of state was in turn overthrown by this fellow. So the threat that is posed by these regimes is actually to themselves predominantly, which is to say that the likelihood of a coup doubles once a coup has happened. So these countries will continue to be unstable. They will continue to have these changes of government. We expect to see a cycle of coups. And if you have that cycle, it will have implications for other things. Economic growth in those countries will be severely curtailed. And remember that as the largest economy in West Africa, typically what happens when you have unstable neighbors is that there will be an influx of persons from unstable neighborhoods to the nearest safe zone, right, that holds prospects for self-actualization, survival, and economic, some form of economic livelihood. And so we must also prepare ourselves for an eventuality in which we are not just looking at military regimes that we can convince to leave power after 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. We could be at the beginning of a cycle that could last at least 10 years or 15 years. If you look at our own history of military coups, you will find that usually once we had a coup, it was the beginning of a cycle that would last somewhere between 5, 10, or even more years, right? So there's no reason to expect that these people in these countries are simply going to be convinced or begged or cajoled to leave power in time. And I think that we must also attune our minds to the implications of that for our own security and strategic objectives. Finally, I've said all this simply to set the stage. I've said all this simply to set the stage. Remember, I started by saying that early warning and preventive diplomacy rest on geotemporal awareness, an awareness of the geostrategic context. We are trying to answer particular questions, notably how the world order is changing, how the world order today is different from what subsisted before, and what the world order that we are going into will look like. So these are the questions that we are trying these are the questions we are trying to answer. And in the last hour or so, what I've done is to try and give us an overview of the trends and the tendencies that are shaping the new era of geopolitics that we are stepping into. Without an understanding of that context, it is not possible to engage in early warning, and it is also not possible to engage in preventive diplomacy. So what we've discussed in the preceding hour has been a very brief overview of a world that is changing, a world in which the new pillars of global governance have not yet become solid, they've not yet been concretized yet. We are leaving the unipolar order and we are coming into a multipolar order. But the rules of the game, the rules of engagement, and remember we've spent a long time, I think we've been describing the last 30 or 40 years, talking about a rules-based order. Well, those rules have changed now, but we have not yet become clear on what they have changed into. So what we've discussed are the trends and the tendencies that I believe will define the world, the age in which we are entering. I think on a final note, when we talk about preventive diplomacy, I want to give a practical example. When the coup in Niger happened, I think 2 years ago, the coup in Niger was different from the coup in, let us say, Burkina Faso and Mali. Unlike the coups in those two countries that were carried out by the mainstream military, the coup in Niger was carried out not by the mainstream military, was carried out by the presidential guard, by the leader of the presidential guard. There was a window of time, about 24 to 48 hours, within which, even though the leader of the coup had announced the coup, he had not secured the buy-in of the mainstream military. And he had to negotiate. So there was that space of time. And it was only after the civilian governors of the provinces had been fired and replaced by the military appointments that the military themselves came on board and it became a full-fledged military regime. Now, I cite that to say that when we talk about preventive diplomacy, accurate early warning analysis, accurate intelligence analysis would have told us that within this window of time, 24 to 48 hours, we have the possibility of intervening. Because remember, the military, it was not a military coup at that point. There was a window of time, but that window of time closed. One of the things that is indispensable about preventive diplomacy or any type of preventive intervention is to recognize when the window of time opens. The window is usually very narrow because the situation is very fluid. So in that instance, we had less than 48 hours. But if we had, of course, we say this now with the benefit of hindsight, right? But if we had intervened within that period, if we had engaged diplomatically with critical stakeholders within that period, recognizing that the mainstream of the military had not taken over, it is quite possible that Niger would still be a democratically led government today. So the enduring lesson from that episode is that early warning analysis, the whole point of early warning work, whether it is being done by intelligence services or early warning institutions or think tanks, even research institutions such as this, is to give us a sense of where the opportunities lie. Often we talk of early warning in terms of threats, trends, risks, but it's also about opportunities for action. So I hope that this has been helpful to all of you. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
On that side, no. Please, can we clap for him again? I told you before now, this at the first lecture that I backslided. We're supposed to be keeping the best for the last, but the best are all coming from the beginning. And in fact, Doctor, I enjoyed your presentation, the lecture. It's so loaded. And I just want to say something. You in a Christian that they say you have the spirit of discernment. I am beginning to think that the two of us, we think alike, we talk alike, we focus on the same issues. In fact, when it was
presenting his lecture. I thought I was on lecturing because that means he believes in the present disposition, the global order, which he talked about, and the trends. And you see, part of the mistake of the developing world is that they don't go by the trends. You know, one thing that he said that actually captured me, is the fact that he said history is an early warning. You see, that is totally pregnant. History is early warning. Well, my elementary political science, and as put forward by Isaac Haller, he said political science we study today's history, and politics today will be history tomorrow. So the history is what we study as political science, and political science, the politics happening today will be history tomorrow. So there's a reputation. One thing that captured me again is the transcendental shifts in global history. You know, the rise and fall of nations, which I also raised this morning. You see, and that is something that we are also not taking into consideration. We are actually not prepared for it. The early warning signs are already there. In 2008, I wrote an article titled Globalization and the Erosion of the Sovereignty of State. In fact, I was very young, I was a junior researcher then. My thought was that sovereignty, the absoluteness that as it was, right from the Westphalian state system, when it is diminishing. In fact, as a matter of fact, no state is sovereign as in sovereign. Most of your powers have been taken away by financial institutions. That's why IMF gives you all the prescription you must follow. World Bank, the United Nations, and other multilateral institutions. In fact, I argue then that the non-state actors are becoming more powerful than the state, and that is the future. Now, let me put it this way again. For those of us who are Christian, the Bible talked about a one world government. The one world government will not drop. There are steps. There are transcendental steps that is taken, and these are all part of it. I was happy you talk about the future. It's not going to be in a polar war or bipolar war. And I think there's a phrase here. You use the word multipolar, but in terms of technology, there's a phrase you use. Now, you call it multiplicity of dominance. I mean something, yeah, which is what I call dispersed hegemons or polyhegemons. That means power is not going to be concentrated in one country anymore. And that is what we should be preparing for. The early warning signs, yes. In fact, the totality is the early warning signs. They are there. But what are you doing? You see, this whole thing transcends spatial temporal parameters. It goes beyond time and space. That's what I mean. So where are we? What is Nigeria doing? What is West Africa? There was countries within the West African nations in ECOWAS. What are they doing? Because the whole idea of early warning is to prepare for a future. She talked about the rule-based order, which was what the liberals were selling to us, rule-based order. And this rule-based order was masterminded by the United States of America and its allies. But in fact, it is also argued, and which is not erroneous, that the rule-based order is in disorder. I don't know whether you understand that. The rule-based order is in disorder. So, are you prepared for the coming disorder and anarchy? Anarchy does not mean the whole world will be in war. We're not going to be fighting wars, but As realists would say, the world, the international system is anarchic. And as the structural realists or neo realists will argue, that it is a structure that determines the anarchic state of the international system and not state itself. Whichever way, whether it is a state, whether it is a structure, we should be prepared for that. That's the early warning, the early warning signs that are showing. Now, I want to add something before I give you the flow. He talked about proxy wars and wars across the globe. Have you had to say why there are proxy wars? It's all about national interests, which he talked about. But it goes beyond national interests. He talked about hegemons. Now, this is just in brief. Let me tell you why the earth today is going to be very uncertain and the proxy wars will continue. Is the fact that conventionally, if a new hegemon is rising, there's supposed to be a warfare to break it, which he talked about. If you look at history, or there have been warfares to bring new hegemons up. But you see, the trends in the 21st century, and this is the fastest era in which hegemons are rising. That conventional warfare you're waiting for will not come. Because China, which is actually the rising hegemon, from the beginning, what did it tell you? What did the country say? Peaceful development. When the country developed a point, it changed. Peaceful rise. When it got to the peak, where they wanted to be, they talked about harmonious world society. As they were getting to another level of development, they changed. They told you shared destiny. As of today, China is not talking about shared destiny, it's talking about a community of shared future, a better world. Invariably, like I told one diplomat from the West, they called me to come and talk about China. I said, I hope you don't mind. There's something I need to tell you here. I don't mean to undermine the West. You are your country. He said, okay. I said, have you read the works of Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilization? He said, of course he knows. I said, okay. Huntington said, I think my boss said it now. Huntington said civilization started in the East and ended in the West. Now, in between that analysis, Africa was not mentioned in any place in regards to civilization. And I said that is the reverse of that is what international relations is. International relations started from the West and it's ending in the East. The East, where China is. The man, I just saw him because his face was angry, and I told him the truth. So what does that mean? That we should prepare for that future. We should begin to prepare for that future. And how do we prepare for that? The alliance is being formed. The alignment is being formed. In fact, the Chinese themselves, it was a Chinese scholar that came up with the word, the phrase, or the word called collectivization, groupings of developing nations, coming together to form a force. And so the future is dispersed hegemons. Like I said in the morning, the powers will be in the economic forms, the power will be in military terms, and the cultural. Everybody's trying to market culture. But one thing that actually touched me and I feel so sad about, you see, when the coup in Nigeria took place, people say, oh, where is NIA? What was NIA done? Oh, this is just between us. Here is the Chatham House, the Chatham House move. Yeah, we get one based on the Chatham House move. Whatever you hear here is this. Well, we're rushing through the trust because this. to say this is an opportunity in this nation that we should take bring down France and take our position in West Africa. There was no need for Nigeria to intervene militarily in Nigeria. In fact, that statement alone actually undermined Nigeria's foreign policy. Nigeria's foreign policy, your immediate neighbor is key, is very strategic. In fact, you cannot allow anything to stop your immediate neighbor. We protect our immediate neighbor because if there's crisis anywhere within your borders, it will precipitate within that. Anyway, that's the but we are here intervene. And you see what the doctor said, the knock says, say, if you intervene in the death, you are also declare war. Because they also know the impact they will face. So these are all the way our signs. And everybody is working to make sure we have a great country. We feel a great country. We shouldn't be where we are. In fact, you talk about AIDS. You know, Modi wrote Dead Days. And I wrote Africa, Dead Days. You don't have any business with it.
Other countries. It's obvious that there are certain conditionalities in order to be involved before those days we actually gave it. You know, as an early warning expert, I think it will be better for Nigeria to go back to the drawing board and rectify some of those undisclosed agreements that we have signed at the issue before those states came on board, because now the states are no longer fluid. That is number one. Then number two, talking about AFRICOM. My PhD research was on AFRICOM. You know, and I said something in my conclusion that was 2016. I said that AFRICOM coming to Africa will not cause any good. Even in some of my publications, I equally emphasize that fact. Because AFRICOM was created in 2007, became operational in 2008, and most African countries fought against it then that they resisted it, that they would not put their foot on the ground. But eventually, you know, through politics, they created their camp at Camp Lemon, and from there have some drone base in Nigeria and other places. But if we can cast our mind back, the insurgency or the crisis in some of these African countries as Sahel actually increased after the creation of Africa, talking about Boko Haram, talking about the insurgency in the Northeast and all these things. And recently it has been reviewed by American Senator himself, one of the congressmen that USAID was actually a conduit pipe they use in sponsoring some of these insurgencies. So I want you at least to have your opinion on that. Then again, talking about Wagner Group, I've carried out a study there. We all concentrate on Wagner Group. There are proliferation of public military company in Sahel region. Like even under the law, we have the security backcom that help in fighting Boko Haram. And I know that there are some private military companies that are operating in Nigeria today, even though federal government may claim not to be aware. Because if you look at the mining that is taking place at Zamfara, and there are a lot of insurgencies, these things like the chairman of our board chairman said in his last interview that a helicopter will come, white men, they will come into Nigeria, you know, drop arms that even the villagers within that area testify to that. These are private military companies that are operating in those areas. Then I have more, but let me stop here. Then coming about coups in Africa. Well, we are talking about the unconstitutional change of government, because ECOWAS, one of their duties is on good governance and unconstitutional change of government. Then, but when we look at the manner of elections, because we only talk about military coups, we don't talk about civilian unconstitutional change of government, because the manner of elections in West Africa has not been okay for some time, for the past 2 decades. I will give examples. You look at Togo, the president died, then the son took over. You know, even he has stayed more than his time, he keep on changing the constitution for him to remain in the office. We look at Cote d'Ivoire, a prominent member of ECOWAS. Hassan Ouattara came on board, challenging Gbagbo because Gbagbo has spent 2 times. Now he has spent 2 times and he has changed constitution to spend another 3rd term. So what are ECOWAS doing about all these things? Because if you don't implement in civilians, I don't see the reason why we should be aggrieved if the military take over power. Thank you very much.
We have learned a lot from it. And most of what you have said here today is likely what we are already aware of. Some research has gone into finding out ways by which we can mitigate or at least slow down the impact, the negative impact that all these things would have on Nigeria, particularly because we are Nigerians, so we are more interested in Nigeria. But my question is, taking an example from the disbanding or diminishing powers of France on Nigeria, and then the invasion of Russia coming in as a new superpower, and having the knowledge of everything you have said already, what would be the possible immediate solutions? Because yes, the problems have been established. But what would you advise if you were to advise the Nigerian government? What would you advise for to be the first steps that should be taken to at least delay or minimize the impact that these new invasions will have on the people of Nigeria or the Nigerian society? Thank you very much. I am Assistant Controller of Customs, Doris.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to make the following comments. Let me first of all appreciate the resources for the brilliant presentation that you have just made. It's highly commendable that the resources in the device lecture practically extend on. I didn't see him look into any notes. This is an indication of somebody who came with avalanche of experience, and I really appreciate that. I have two comments to make and another clarification. By the way, my name is Woguw Olarusi. I am from the Department of State Services. I'd like to say that while in your comments, you said that whenever people make comments about certain peculiarities to Nigerians, that you always cut them off because most of these things are not peculiar to Nigeria. I share such mentality as well. Because that what is currently happening in America, especially with what's going on with the Department of Government Efficiency that was established by the American president, where we have Elon Musk coming up with a lot of revelations on how money have been dispersed, spent, and how the interventionist agencies have become conduits for money laundering. If it was Nigeria, this is what you see every day on the media. We will continue to berate ourselves and present these issues as if there was nothing wrong that controlled this country. We have reports from these departments of government about how the agency of government is funding several inanities across the world, how to train youth in Yugoslavia or wherever states, these are countries, on how to use social media. These are opportunities to learn them, but because it is in America, we don't seek to pay attention. But if it was PDP or somebody from APC or somebody who intends on foreign, it will continue to dominate the media consistently. So I want to agree with you that yes, the rain is everywhere. As human managers, we owe it to ourselves when we go back to also know how to manage our own issues. That's the first one. Then the second issue is the way you raised about the factors that we notice when we begin to see changing superpowers. You highlighted a number of factors, and of course you mentioned that there is possibility of warfare. Just like the professor mentioned, that of course we will not see the conventional warfare that we have always anticipated. And I agree. Of course, there will be economic warfare. Recall that currently the president of America is threatening BRICS. that any country that wants to supplant or join the organization to supplant the domination of the American dollar would pay severe. And in fact, it's requesting for international commitment from countries of the world to either continue or discontinue their relationship with Greece or align with the American government. For me, that is warfare. And I agree with you when you talk about how do we begin to negotiate our strategic autonomy. Yeah, we use that particular phrase. How do we begin to negotiate our strategic autonomy as a country, and of course, how to balance our relationship between the American and of course our current status in Greece. So yes, I agree with that. That yes, there's going to be tendencies for war. It might not be warfare as we have it. Of course, we don't have economic warfare as it currently stands. And then the last one that I want to make comment about is all of these early warning signs that we speak about. Just for the benefit of hindsight, do you think we would be talking differently today if we didn't have Trump in the White House? For example, if Kamala Harris had won that election, if we didn't have anyone as disruptive as Trump in America, NATO was still significantly aligned with Ukraine, for example. NATO will probably not ask other European countries to pay 5% commitment of their national budget, for example. So, do you think that in the next 4 years, for instance, if Trump leaves office and we have another government in power who is sympathetic to NATO, who is sympathetic to Europe, do you think we can begin to see some of the reversal of the disruptions that we're seeing today in the global state? Thank you very much for the opportunities.
Well, thank the presenter for well stipulated in the presentation. Mine is a very simple question, and that is, what do you think weaker nations should do in the face of consistent violation of their national sovereignty? Now, if this continues, do you foresee a situation where sovereignty in international diplomacy will be abolished? And then how should they respond to this kind of threats of might? My name is Dr. Victor Woguw from the National Peace Center.
Thank you very much. I'll be on that.
Should do, and if I foresee sovereignty being abolished, I wouldn't say that sovereignty will be formally abolished. I think that when we look back, sovereignty has not always been, yes, notionally we know that sovereignty is inviolate, we know that it is sacrosanct, but in practice, when we look back at history, the US invaded Grenada in 1983, invaded Panama in 1989. You have invasions that have happened where those military actions were really the products of military might, really. And neither the UN Security Council or any strictures of international law appeared to affect that, because this is what powerful nations do. But I think what we must also take note of is the right to protect, R2P, the principle of R2P, was developed, I think, in the late 90s. And the idea was that where it is believed that a government is threatening the lives of civilians, its own civilian population, where perhaps the likelihood of genocide is high, that sovereignty cannot be invoked by that government. In other words, international forces can intervene to prevent either a genocide or to prevent mass atrocities from being perpetrated by the government. And we saw the first, I think, we saw the first major example of that in 2013 when NATO cited the rights to protect principle, invoked it under UN Security Council 1973 to invade Libya. The problem was that even though they cited the right to protect principle, it turned out that they were simply using it as a pretext to invade the country. Right to protect is about protecting the civilian population. It's not about regime change, but it turned out that they used that as a pretext to topple Gaddafi, and it ended up destroying that country as a coherent entity. So I think, in fact, the reason why Libya is relevant is that when we talk about the destabilization of the Sahel, we often don't mention Libya, right? But the destabilization of the Sahel most recently, when you look at the toppling of Gaddafi, the fact that his armories, the armories of Gaddafi's security forces were looted, and that they were seized by Tuareg insurgents that used them to launch their insurgencies in the Sahel. The most significant destabilizing issue in the Sahel in the last 20 years has actually been the Western invasion of Libya. And it's very important for us to stress that in our own recollection of how the Sahel came to be destabilized. It was the destabilization of Libya that created a chain reaction that affected Mali, because that's where the Tuareg insurgency was launched. And then from Mali, the Tuareg insurgency, but also the Islamist extremist insurgency spread to Burkina Faso and to Niger. So that is that. But in terms of whether sovereignty will be abolished, no, I don't think it will be formally abolished. I think that what you will have is a situation in the near future, in the medium term even, where powerful countries simply do what they will. They will invoke national security, the need to protect national security, and then they move into a country, create a buffer zone there, or take mineral resources or whatever. They will do that. And because the Security Council has been silent in other instances, it is going to be very difficult to argue that if Rwanda invades Eastern Congo, a crime has been committed, but Israel can invade Lebanon and we're okay with it. So once the basis of a common order collapses, then it leaves powerful countries to do as they will. But there will be no abolition of sovereignty in the near term, in my view. I don't think that we're going to see that. The other question you asked is, what can weak nations do? One of the things that weak nations can do is to create alliances, to forge alliances with other nations. The idea of banding together, if you look at NATO, for example, the most militarily significant powers in NATO are UK, France, and Germany. Nobody is thinking of Liechtenstein or Sweden or any of them. That's not what we are thinking of. But there is strength in numbers, right? So countries that are weak have to find what they can trade for strategic alliances that can provide a defensive umbrella for them. Or they might find that they need to partner with another country, a larger country, or a much more powerful country. It's all about alliances. Once you recognize that you're strategically disadvantaged, then the next best thing is to find what kind of alliances you can get into that can help provide a protective umbrella, for you. And there are many examples of that, where countries enter mutual defense pacts. Recently, Iran signed one with Russia, essentially a very comprehensive partnership that includes mutual defense. And you will find examples of that elsewhere. But those, for me, that's the option that is available to a weak country. I have to say that the weak country, it depends on what kind of weakness we're talking about. A country can be militarily weak, but it can be resource rich. If it is resource rich, then it has something it can trade. But if it is militarily weak and resource poor, it's not very likely that they will be able to attract the kind of alliances that would protect them in the near term. So I hope I've answered that. I think you asked about the likelihood of there being somebody else after Trump, possibly a Democrat, that would then reverse some of these things. It is possible, but one of the things that is interesting that we're observing is that this looks, first of all, I have to say that Trump, even though we talk a lot about Trump, but Trump is simply one aspect of a global phenomenon. The rise of far-right, extreme right-wing parties, across democratic Western democracies, and not just Western democracies. Israel is under the most extreme right-wing government it has had in recent history. But when you come to Europe, what we are seeing is that right-wing parties are advancing. Right-wing parties, by definition, are not very interested in immigration. They are not interested in globalization. A lot of them are invested in economic nationalism, and they believe in, I think, for want of a better term, they believe in the racial purity of their countries, which is why they oppose immigration, anything that dilutes the racial integrity of their countries as they perceive it. So we are seeing a rise, of those kind of parties, far-right parties. Previously, maybe 10, 15 years ago, those parties were considered to be fringe movements, the kind of parties that come and they score 0.5% of the national votes, and they were ignored. But those sentiments have been rising, right? And so for Trump in the US, it is Trump that is the most profound manifestation of the rise of these movements. But Germany had a parliamentary election this weekend where the winners were right-wing parties, and even the extreme right-wing party came second. And that's the party that, praises Hitler and all of that. In France, it's very likely that France will have a right-wing president by 2027. The right-wing parties have been making significant gains. In the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Finland, Sweden and Finland, it's the same thing. In Italy is already under a right-wing government. So these are governments that have all these things in common. They want to either weaponize aid or use aid in more transactional ways. So for example, much like what Trump has said, the Italian Prime Minister, the leader of the French right-wing party has said she does not believe that aid should be given if something is not being gotten in return. And France is one of the largest contributors to the EU Official Development Assistance Pool. So that tells you that if she comes into power, you can expect that there will be a reduction in aid. Britain, has reduced aid. The UK aid budget has been reduced. This is as of now, of recent. And I mean, Britain is even funny because you have two right-wing parties. You have Reform UK and you have the Conservatives. And I think all of you have, I'm sure you all hear about Kemi's vituperations about immigration and all of that. But she has to sound like that, because if she doesn't sound like that, they will not win an election. I actually don't believe that they will still win the election. It's like you cannot be more white than the white person. So if a Kemi complains about the level of immigration, they will agree with her, but the likelihood is that they will vote for the person who is actually white that says the same thing, right? But I raise that point to say that when you measure or assess public opinion in Western democracies, a lot of Western democracies, it has tilted in this direction. And it has tilted in this direction because there are high levels of inequality in those societies. So as a result, people that are disgruntled or people that perceive themselves to have been left behind are more likely to adopt these kind of ideologies. And there's a simple logic that explains this. When things are hard, when there's scarcity, people become more tribal. If you use the example of a polygamous household, in a time of abundance, everybody is fine There's no difference between the son of the first wife and the son of the second wife or the son of the third wife. When there is scarcity, then everybody starts to know who the son of the first wife, who the first wife is, who the second wife is, who the illegitimate child is. Identity becomes more salient in times of economic hardship. So once there's a recession, you have this sentiment. So right-wing sentiments, which are very heavily based around identity, always come to the fore. When you have recessions, depressions, the economy is not doing well, high levels of inequality, and all of that. So if you look at the 1930s, the rise of Hitler was about this kind of, precisely this kind of situation. You know, the National Socialists or the Nazis came to power during the Great Depression, right? When the German economy had collapsed and things were very, very bad. Once things are extreme, times of extreme hardship, people become more tribal, right? And so we expect to see more racism, more right-wing ascendancy in these places. So Trump, because Trump is president of the United States, he's prominent and he's significant, but we must not feel like he's not an outlier. He's part of a broader global movement, a broader global tendency. So the likelihood, the jury is still out, but it is quite possible that Trump will be succeeded by a Republican. Somebody like him, maybe the VP, the vice president, the current vice president. It could be anybody really, but it looks to me like the way that they are operating. So, for example, some of the executive orders that he has issued, they want to codify them by law, right? So it is quite likely that my belief personally is that these people are not preparing just to govern for 4 years and go away. They want to create a longer term dynasty, for want of a better word. Create something that after these 4 years it will be succeeded by another person, and then these people will be able to completely reshape the American government in their image, right? That is my conjecture, my prognosis going forward. Okay, I think Madam, you asked about what to do about France and Russia's supplanting of France in West Africa. I think that first of all, my belief, my argument is that for a long time, we've not seen ourselves as a regional hegemon. And to a large extent, we don't see ourselves as a regional hegemon. In the 1970s, there was a generation of Nigerian foreign policy practitioners that actively thought of themselves as part of our national responsibility, included a responsibility for the rest of the continent. We had a much deeper sense of our place in the world. We've lost that in recent, and I don't mean, it's not about this administration or even in the last 20 or 25 years, we've not thought in geostrategic terms. And once you don't think in geostrategic terms, you become blind to all these things happening around you. So I would say that the first thing is to accept that we are a regional hegemon, to understand that West Africa uniquely is within our sphere of influence. Then we need to ask ourselves, what kind of influence do we want that to be? So there are some things that we have championed. We championed free movement within ECOWAS. We champion continental integration. But sometimes it also feels like we just signed these documents because they said we should be signing them. We are not thinking deeply about the implications. Nigerians have we have the largest diasporic community in West Africa. If you come and you move across West Africa, you will find that Nigerian traders and entrepreneurs are a very significant bloc. It is in our interest to promote free movement. I hope you understand what I mean. It is in our interest to promote free movement because our people are the biggest beneficiaries, right? But from time to time, somebody might wake up and say, you know what, let's just close the border because of rights or vehicles or something, And then you forget that if another country takes reciprocal action, more of your people will suffer. Do you understand this?
Yeah.
If let's say, for example, Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana decides to sanction Nigerian traders in in their markets, right? In those countries. And we say we want to sanction Ghanaian traders and Ivorian traders in Nigeria. When you weigh the two things, who do you think is going to suffer? How many Ivorian traders do you suppose are here? I hope you understand this. We are an entrepreneurial people. We go out, we spread out. That is what we do. So anything that enables that movement to happen is important, right? Protection of free trade, protection of free movement within the zone. And when I say free movement, I must be clear because I know there's this tendency to blame free movement on insecurity. There's nothing in the free movement, the protocol of free movement, that says you should allow armed people stroll across your borders. Even in a common trade area where you have free movement, such as the Schengen area, you can't simply stroll across people's borders armed, right? So the thing is, when we say free movement, there are institutional things that we are meant to have in place. So saying free movement does not mean that people can carry weapons, all kinds of weapons, stroll across your border really free of charge. No. But what I'm saying is that as a regional hegemon, there are certain ways that we must take. So let me give an example. I mentioned the threat of Ebola, for example, as an example. Ebola was a Liberian national that came to Nigeria and all of that. When Ebola broke out in Nigeria, people cannot remember, but our doctors were on strike. People can't remember this thing. Our doctors were actually on strike. That fellow ended up in a private hospital, right? If another country, a smaller country in West Africa, had this problem and its doctors were on strike, the country would have ended. I hope you understand. The country would have ended. That is the difference in science and skill, that your public healthcare system can be frozen, but your private, the amount of private healthcare capacity you have still exceeds what other smaller countries have. I hope you understand. I am not saying that we are perfect. What I'm saying is that relative to our neighbors, we are very well resourced. And if we do a much better job of managing our resources, our influence will even be greater. So, for example, we have the Technical Aid Corps, right? Established in the 1980s. It goes to ACP countries, Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific, right? Why don't we deploy the Technical Aid Corps to shore up the health systems at source in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in DRC, in the places in Central Africa that we know are the hotspots for Ebola? I hope you understand this. Why wait for the thing to come and meet us when you can deploy and solve it at source? Do you understand this? Let me give another example unrelated to West Africa. The British NHS, despite the rhetoric of British politicians, is deeply dependent on foreign migrant labor. The people that they call migrants. If they were white people in an African country, we call them expatriates, right? But because of the psychological balance of power, we think that they are doing us a favor, right, by employing these people. When in actual fact, if we had our wits about us, we would recognize that if you pull out foreign migrants from the NHS, it will collapse. They do not have the human capital to run NHS by themselves. So instead of making it look like they are doing us a favor and every 5 minutes we are complaining about people, medical migration or whatever, why not turn it into a technical aid program? Why not? Your health sector workers are going to these places. They are trained in Nigeria. They go to those places, they work, they are significant stakeholders within that section. But instead of making it look like it's just happenstance, why not create a program that says the same way you send technical aid corps doctors to Uganda is the same way you send them to the UK. You can create a bond program. You know why this sounds unbelievable? It sounds
unbelievable because we believe that white people are the perpetual benevolent people. Then they will always be the benefactors and we will always be the beneficiaries, even when the evidence suggests the opposite. I hope you understand this. So this thing is about thinking. It's about a whole new way of thinking. But if you're saying, how do we engage the realities in West Africa? This is what I'm saying. That we must embrace our responsibility as a regional hegemon. We must recognize that West Africa is our sphere of influence. Sorry?
Yes, I was going to ask
Yes.
that the agreements, regional and multilateral agreements, do they limit these decisions that we could make based on the new changes we're having in the environment? Do you think that these agreements we're already party to are a limitation to agreement to new rules we'll be making that will influence our everything that we're talking about here differently?
No.
Are we tied? Are we tied?
No. We're not. No, we're not tied. Nothing. No, we're not. Our position, first of all, you have to recognize that the principal treaty of ECOWAS is called what? Treaty of Lagos, right? Treaty of Lagos. ECOWAS was our brainchild. It's something that we created after the Civil War intentionally because we recognized at the time that France had used proxies during the Civil War to try to balkanize Nigeria. And the belief at that time was that there must be deliberate outreach in the sub-region that brings Nigeria together with the Francophone countries, right? And so we created ECOWAS. Then we create, of course, ECOWAS is about free movement, free trade, and all of that. There's nothing. We are the ones that stand to benefit the most from a functional ECOWAS. It's entirely, this is about us. None of those agreements hinders us in any way. Even with those agreements, countries look to Nigeria for leadership, right? Some years ago, I was in Mali in the company of an Ivorian who works for ECOWAS, and I met the then Nigerian. We had a meeting with the Nigerian ambassador, but this Ivorian was very open. In fact, what he was saying was that the Francophone countries need Nigeria to step in and liberate them from France, right? So I think that we have to recognize that this thing is primarily psychological. It's about the way we think of ourselves in relation to our environment, our immediate environment. So sometimes people say things like, but you're proposing spending money in other countries when you don't have enough resources to, use for yourself. And no country has optimal resources. That's why even a country as rich as the US, you can see scaling back aid. We are not talking about philanthropy here. What we are talking about is using our resources strategically to gain influence and to be a stabilizing force in the region around us, because we know that instability will also negatively impact us. I think there was a first question. Yes, I remember. There was a first question. I'll answer them very quickly. One must be careful. You reference Congressman Scott Perry's allegations. Honestly, they remain allegations. He provided no evidence of this. And we must not fall victim to the idea that simply because a US politician, who is a politician like any other type of politician you can imagine, says something, that it must be the gospel truth. American politicians lie as much as anybody else lie, right? And what is happening is that in the US, the new administration is essentially purging government of the other elite factions. So in order to do that, they are saying whatever they need to say to discredit all those agencies and all of that. But more importantly, and I think this is really important because I was really disappointed by our media in the aftermath of the man's remarks. There's abundant research, scholarly, evidence-based investigation reports that explain the evolution of Boko Haram, how it gets its funding, and all of that. There's absolutely nothing mysterious about it at all. Certainly nothing on the order of
the United States is funding or you say it's funding Boko Haram. Absolutely not, right? So we can speak to the issue of the funding of Boko Haram or even deal with the problem of Boko Haram without falling victim to conspiracy theories that are being retailed by an American politician. But the last question you asked was, what is ECOWAS doing about us? And you make a very important point, and we have these conversations as well, that ECOWAS seems to be very strident when it comes to unconstitutional changes of government. But when elected governments behave badly, we don't seem to say anything. That is actually the challenge before ECOWAS. There's a protocol on democracy and good governance, right? That is really the centerpiece of all the things we've talked about in terms of standards, in terms of how institutions should behave, in terms of a social contract. That document should be what we use in championing the good behavior of elected governments. Not just, it is easy to shout at a military government that has seized power. But what happens if a democratically elected government is shooting protesters, murdering protesters, or doing any of these really terrible things? So that is where I agree with you. And this is agreed on, within ECOWAS circles that we must do better in dealing with this particular type of problem. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Sometimes when we go on and off about Africa, it's funny, because you see, whether we like it, every policy and every initiative is a tool by the superpowers to dominate. And so, and I'm very glad that the Nigerian government at the time actually NIA played a very great role in asking the government not to accept Africa. And as a matter of fact, Nigeria also plays its part in terms of foreign policy that no country within West Africa should accept Africa. And so, so I think let's leave the discussion of Africa to the Americans. Because I've known this is the only command in the whole world out of the 5 command, which is the 6th command, Africa was the 6th command, that has a civilian component. Right? Now, and you raise the issues of the criteria given for access to the agent. And which is one of the problems I had with them when I was in DC, I had the Union Development Challenge, when they were told that Nigeria didn't meet the criteria to access it. And I asked them what are the criteria, and they told me gender balance, education, and they called this, they raised a lot of issues. And I asked them one question: who sets this criteria? And who are the ones that actually determine whether we meet the criteria for access? And they got to be Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. And I told them, how can an NGO determine whether a country, a sovereign country, and I said this is wrong. In fact, they didn't like that meeting, and I told them this is wrong. In fact, smaller countries were meeting the criteria, and they said Nigeria didn't meet it. So, you see, these are our tools to subjugate, undermine, dominate developing countries. And like we rightly say, the truth is that proxy wars will continue because the dominant hegemon doesn't want to give up. And so it has to disrupt the system to keep its position. But unfortunately, it cannot. The world has changed. We have moved beyond that. There's reconfiguration and redefinition of the international system that's ongoing. And so now, among my unified law, like this, can you ask a question?
One area in which different countries, various countries will have to arrive at a consensus on how exactly to deal with this threat, because it's an unfolding issue, it's an unfolding area of opportunity. It's a bit like, let's say something like drones, for example, the use of some drones, unarmed aerial vehicles. When it was dominated by just one superpower, or when there was one country that seemed to have a monopoly over the technology, it was relatively controllable, it was okay. But now that drone technology is that it's even non-state actors use drones. we are going to come to a point where we now have to have some ground rules about the employment of these particular types of weapons. So I suspect that the same thing will happen with private military companies. We'll have to have some kind of consensus on how they should operate. Yeah, we'll have to have some kind of consensus on how they should operate. It's still an evolving field, right? After Blackwater is an American private military company. After killings that were carried out by members of Blackwater in Iran, it raised a lot of debates. There are major problems. But you see, the thing is, from the perspective of a foreign country, using using private military companies is strategically useful and is politically cheaper. If you send your own troops into harm's way, it can be politically costly. But if you send a private military company that is being paid for the work, the political cost is much lower. So you can see that there's an incentive for these countries to send in these kinds of companies. And it's not just the companies, it's not just the private military companies themselves. Often in different places, these private military companies, they will not be retained by government, they will be retained by other corporations. You talk about multinational corporations. So how does a multinational corporation, for example, secure mines in high-risk areas? It knows that it cannot appeal to the government of that country because it is too weak. It cannot appeal to its own home country because they will not send troops. The next best thing is to send a private military company that can protect that investment. So I suspect that that is where we are going with this particular trend. But ultimately, we will have to arrive at a consensus. The position I think with the AU is that they don't want mercenaries of any kind in Africa. But remember what I said, this is about great power politics. If a PMC from a great power shows up, where is the AU force that is going to go and expel them from that place? Or is even going to fill the security vacuum? Because remember, part of the reason why you have the presence of PMCs in the Sahel particularly is because Operation Wakani has been sent out. The G5 Sahel has collapsed. The UN forces were also expelled. So now you have a security vacuum. So a whole government can say there's a security vacuum and the way to solve this is for me to get a private military company. Even if the AU or other regional bodies say our preference is not to have mercenaries. But if that is our preference, then that means that we should be willing to mobilize forces and fill that security vacuum. I hope you understand what I mean. International relations does not permit vacuums. So once you remove France, it will be Russia. If you remove Russia, it may be China. There will always be somebody to fill the void until we take the responsibility to fill it ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Prior to the PMCs, we used to call them, in international relations, we say privatization of war. It was this business. These things had already in existence, but we don't go for this privatization of war. War have become business. And so they are all involved. Thank you very much. Generalization now, on that note, I hand over to the call director, Mr. Bonaji, to give us our next itinerary.
Thank you. Please, a round of applause for Rachel Hudson.